Welcome to History Date Night, a World War II podcast covering the Second World War in chronological order, from the opening shots to final victory. I'm Justin, and joining me is my wife and co-host, Jenny. Together we explore the people, battles, and turning points that shape the deadliest conflict in human history, one date at a time. On this episode,
exactly the wrong use of an aircraft carrier.
It is an expensive lesson.
The moment he was gone, the crew sprang into action.
Welcome back to History Date Night. I'm Justin. Last episode we covered September 11th through the 15th. The Ark Royal was nearly sunk, the first U-boat destroyed, the Orzel submarine trapped in Estonia, Charles Lindbergh's isolationist broadcast, and the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, ending in a Soviet victory that freed Stalin to look west. That last point is about to matter enormously.
I'm Jenny, and I want to flag right now that this is one of the episodes I've been dreading a little. Because September 17th is the day that Poland, already being invaded by Germany from the west, gets invaded by the Soviet Union from the east. We're going to spend some time on that, because I think it tends to get treated as a footnote when it was anything but. But we'll get there. There's quite a bit happening before that.
There is. September 16th through the 19th is 4 days that contain some of the most consequential events of the entire opening month of the war. A French offensive quietly collapses, a British aircraft carrier is sunk, a submarine escapes internment with no charts, a propaganda operation begins that will run for years, and two of the largest armies in the world shake hands over the body of a country they've just divided between them.
Let's start. September 16th, a Saturday, the Saar Offensive, France's only significant military action since declaring war, comes to an end. And not because France was pushed back. France withdraws voluntarily, without being forced to, after the operation fails to divert a single German division from Poland. The French had pushed about 5 miles into Germany on a 15-mile front, taken a handful of villages, and stopped cold on the Siegfried Line. That's it. That's the entire Allied contribution to Poland's defense.
To understand how extraordinary that failure was, remember the numbers. On paper, France had 85 fully armed divisions facing Germany's western border. Germany had 34 divisions there, but most of them were reserves, because all of its best troops and tanks were in Poland. The French had the numerical superiority, they had the initiative, and they had a treaty obligation to Poland that specifically promised an offensive within 15 days of mobilization. They sent 9 divisions on a gentle probe and then went home.
Poland fought for France in World War I. Hundreds of thousands of Poles died in the Western Front, and when Poland needed France to return the favor, France launched what its own commander called a little test. The bitterness that the Polish government in exile will carry toward France for the rest of the war has its roots in exactly this moment.
While France is standing down, life in Britain is adapting to war in some revealing ways. On September 16th, 31 first-class football matches are played as friendlies on an amateur basis. The professional leagues have been suspended. The newspapers dutifully report results. One correspondent notes that the Halifax versus Leeds match was played at a level usually associated with the village green. And in London, the famous Yorkshire cricketer, Len Hutton, gets married. The wedding brought forward from October because of the war, with movie tone and pathé newsreels in attendance. Normal life insisting on itself even as everything was changing.
Ireland, or IRA in Irish, is establishing a ministry of supplies and introducing rationing. Petroleum products, coal, gas, textiles, even tea are being rationed to less than a quarter of peacetime levels. Britain is restricting shipping to Ireland as pressure to support the Allied cause, and Churchill in particular is furious that Ireland won't return the treaty ports. 3 harbor facilities the British had handed back to Irish control just the year before. Irish Prime Minister De Valera holds firm on neutrality. The relationship between Britain and Ireland during this war is its own complicated story.
Also on September 16th, and this is one of those details that you couldn't invent, Frank Sinatra records All or Nothing at All with Harry James and his orchestra. He's 23 years old. The record is released in 1940 and barely noticed. It won't become a hit until 1943, when Sinatra goes solo and re-releases it. The most famous voice of the 20th century is in a recording studio in New York on the day that France abandons Poland, and nobody pays much of attention to either event. Also on September 17th, And we need to cover this before we get to the main event of the day. HMS Courageous is sunk southwest of Ireland. Courageous is one of the Royal Navy's aircraft carriers, converted from a World War I battle cruiser. She's old, but she is a carrier, and losing a carrier 2.5 weeks into the war is a serious blow. She's been deployed on anti-submarine patrol, hunting U-boats in the Atlantic.
Which turns out to be exactly the wrong use of an aircraft carrier. Courageous has just turned into the wind to recover her aircraft when U-29 hits her with 2 torpedoes on the port side. Damage control can't contain the flooding. The order to abandon ship comes 5 minutes after the torpedoes hit. She sinks 10 minutes after that. 518 men are killed. 742 survive.
Already, the Royal Navy's luck with the Ark Royal has run out, and the barely avoided nightmare of losing a carrier this early in the war becomes reality. The Royal Navy draws an immediate lesson from this, and draws it correctly. You do not use fleet carriers to hunt submarines. Carriers are too large, too slow to maneuver, and too valuable to risk in open ocean anti-submarine patrols. The best way to sink U-boats is to wait for them to come to the convoys where they can be hunted by destroyers and corvettes in a defended environment. Courageous is the lesson that teaches this. It is an expensive lesson, 518 men expensive.
And it happens on the same day as the Soviet invasion of Poland. September 17th, 1939 is one of the most brutal single days of the entire opening of the war.
Just before dawn on September 17th, the Red Army crosses Poland's eastern border along its full 800-mile length, about the distance from Dallas to Atlanta in the United States. The Polish High Command is taken completely by surprise. Border guards are brushed aside. Soviet forces advance virtually unopposed into Polish territory. Within hours, it is clear that it is not a border incident. This is a full invasion.
Poland has been fighting Germany from the west for 17 days. The army is battered, supplies are running out, Warsaw is under siege, and the government has relocated twice. And now, in the middle of all of that, 800 miles of eastern frontier opened up simultaneously. There is no reserve to send east. There is nothing to send.
Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov summons the Polish ambassador to Moscow and delivers a statement. He tells him that since the Polish Republic is no longer in existence, the Soviet Union is taking measures to protect the inhabitants of Belorussia and the western Ukraine. That's the official justification. Stalin has been accusing Poland of violating Soviet airspace for weeks, building the pretext. Now he uses it.
It's worth pausing on how cynical that statement is. Poland is not no longer in existence. It's fighting. Its government is functioning. Its army is in the field. Stalin is declaring a country extinct when its soldiers are still shooting. The language is chosen specifically to deny Poland any legal standing to object, because you can't protest a violation of your sovereignty if your sovereignty no longer exists according to the person violating it.
The Polish government is on the road south toward Romania when the Soviet invasion begins. President Maskitski, Marshal Rud Smigel, and the cabinet cross the Romanian border and are immediately interned by the Romanian government, which is under German pressure to hold them. Poland's legitimate government is in a Romanian internment camp within hours of the Soviet invasion. A government in exile will reconstitute in Paris and later in London, but the continuity of Polish statehood from this moment forward rests on some extremely fragile threads.
On the eve of the Jewish New Year, the Luftwaffe dive bombs the Jewish quarter of Warsaw. St. John's Cathedral is bombed during Mass. It had already been hit once before. The dead are being buried in public parks because the cemeteries are full. Inside the city, the defenders have just beaten back a major German armored assault. Major General Chuma's forces knocked out 60 German tanks and forced General Reinhardt to report that if ordered to continue the attack, his 4th Panzer Division would cease to be operational. Warsaw is holding, but it cannot hold forever, and now there is no relief coming from any direction.
The reaction around the world to the Soviet invasion is fascinating and revealing. Britain and France are technically at war with Germany over the invasion of Poland. They are not at war with the Soviet Union, even though the Soviet Union has also invaded Poland. The political calculus is brutal. Britain and France cannot fight Germany and the Soviet Union simultaneously. So instead of declaring war, they protest diplomatically and do nothing else. Poland's ambassador in London, Count Rakuzinski, sends a formal note of protest. It is received politely, and then nothing happens.
In Stalin's public justification that Russia and Germany will help the Poles establish new conditions for political life, is one of the more chilling pieces of diplomatic language in the entire war. Help the Poles, after invading them from behind while Germany was already invading them from the front.
There is a human detail from September 18th that I think captures the weight of this moment better than any military statistic. Stanisław...
We're doing our best here.
And this is bad because he's actually a well-known guy and I'm struggling, so I'm very sorry, everyone. Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, known in Poland as Witkasi, was one of the most important Polish artists, writers, and philosophers of his generation. A playwright, a painter, a thinker. On September 18th, when news of the Soviet invasion reaches him in the village where he's been sheltering, he takes his own life. He was 54 years old. He had fought in World War I, survived it, built a career, and when he understood what the invasion from the east meant, that there was nowhere to go, no free Poland to fight for, he decided he was done. His suicide note was not recorded, but the reasoning could be surmised.
He understood immediately what it would take the rest of the world years to fully absorb. Poland wasn't just being defeated in a war, it was being erased. Against all of that darkness, there are some stories from September 18th that deserve to be told in detail. The Polish submarine Orzel interned in Tallinn, Estonia, in the Baltic Sea since September 15th. Initially, Estonia was friendly with the Polish crew, but after diplomatic pressure from Germany and the Soviet Union, the Orzel's charts are confiscated, her weapons and ammunition in the process of being removed, and her crew essentially prisoners on board their own ship. But the crew didn't sit still. Below deck, a quiet rebellion was taking shape.
The submarine's chief officer, Lieutenant Jan Grudzinski, and his first officer, Lieutenant Andrzej Piasecki, were done... Piasecki, I'm pretty sure. They were done waiting. If they didn't act soon, Orzel would be fully disarmed and lost to the war forever. So on the 16th of September, Grudzinski made his move. He sabotaged the torpedo hoist, a small act of defiance that stopped the Estonians from removing the last 6 aft torpedoes. It was a Sunday, and no replacement equipment could be brought in, so the clock had started ticking. Meanwhile, boatswain Władysław... I'm getting all the hard names here. Władysław Narkiewicz slipped into a small harbor boat. Under the innocent guise of being a fisherman, he charted the depths of the escape route they hoped to take. Another sailor quietly weakened the mooring lines. Piece by piece, the crew was preparing their breakout.
Then, on September 17th, news reached the crew. The Soviet Union had invaded Poland. Their homeland was being crushed from both sides. Escape was no longer a bold idea. It was a necessity. Just after midnight on the 18th of September, fate intervened. The port's lights suddenly failed and darkness swallowed the harbor. Grudzinski didn't hesitate. He ordered the crew to ready the submarine. But just as the plan was unfolding, an Estonian officer arrived for a surprise inspection. For 30 agonizing minutes, the crew stood at attention, hiding their preparations in plain sight. Finally, satisfied, the officer wished them good night and stepped ashore. The moment he was gone, the crew sprang into action. 2 Estonian guards were lured aboard and quietly taken prisoner. The harbor lights were sabotaged. The weakened mooring lines were hacked through with an axe. Engines rubbled to life, and in the pitch-black harbor, Orzel began to slip away.
But the escape didn't go unnoticed for long. Searchlights snapped on, slicing through the darkness until they found the fleeing submarine. Machine guns and light artillery opened fire, bullets and shells hammering and damaging the conning tower of the submarine. Heavier guns weren't used as the Estonians feared hitting their own ships in harbor. At the harbor mouth, Orzel struck a sandbar. For a moment, she was stuck, and it seemed like the escape would be stopped. But with the engines roaring, the Orzel broke free. Orzel slipped into the Baltic Sea, wounded but free, beginning one of the most daring submarine odysseys of the Second World War. They began a 27-day voyage through heavily patrolled waters to reach Scotland, with no navigational papers. The Soviets are furious because of this. They accuse Estonia of failing to maintain its neutrality by allowing the Orzel to escape. And this accusation becomes one of the pretexts the Soviet Union will use when it pressures the Baltic states the following year. A Polish submarine crew pulling off a daring prison break in an Estonian harbor ends up contributing to the Soviet justification for absorbing Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into the USSR. The Orzel's voyage to Scotland is one of the great undertold stories of the early war. We will come back to her.
Also, on September 18th, something happens that will matter enormously for a long arc of the war, though almost nobody knows about it at the time. Members of Poland's Cipher Bureau, the mathematicians and analysts who had been secretly working on cracking Germany's Enigma encryption machine, flee Poland and head for Paris. They carry with them their knowledge, their methods, and crucially, their years of work breaking into German military communications. They will eventually make their way to Britain and connect with the operation at Bletchley Park. The intelligence that flows from that collaboration will arguably shorten the war by years. It begins with a group of Polish mathematicians crossing a border with their work in their heads.
On September 18th, German and Soviet forces physically meet at Brest-Litovsk, a city roughly 200 kilometers east of Warsaw on the Bug River. It's a city with history. It's where Germany and Russia signed the treaty that ended the First World War on the Eastern Front in 1918. Now, 21 years later, German and Soviet soldiers are shaking hands there over a Poland they've divided between them. Both governments hold a joint military parade in the city. There are photographs of Soviet red stars and Nazi swastikas decorating the city, and Soviet and German troops marching together in parade. It is a chilling sight, considering actions that come later in the war.
Also beginning on September 18th, someone who comes to be known as Lord Haw-Haw makes his first broadcast. A man named William Joyce starts making English-language propaganda broadcasts over German radio, directed at Britain. His opening signature is, "Germany calling, delivered in a sneering, upper-class English accent. The name Lord Haw-Haw gets attached to him almost immediately, coined by a Daily Express journalist. Millions of British listeners will tune in, sometimes more for the entertainment value than out of sympathy for the message, but the reach is real.
Joyce's background is pretty interesting. He was actually born in Brooklyn, New York, to an Irish father who had become an American citizen. He did grow up in Ireland and England, joined Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, and fled to Germany just before the war began ahead of his expected arrest. Legally speaking, he was likely an American citizen when he started broadcasting for Nazi Germany. He'll be tried for treason after the war anyway, on the basis that he held a British passport, and he'll be hanged. But for 6 years, his voice is in British living rooms, and people will listen.
September 19th. Hitler enters the free city of Danzig, the port city whose status was one of the state justifications for the entire invasion, and he gives a speech. He swears that Danzig will be German forever and that Germany will fight to the bitter end. He denounces the Polish government, calls the war Britain's fault, and then says something that sends British intelligence scrambling. He says Germany may, and quote, use a weapon which is not yet known and with which we ourselves cannot be attacked.
British intelligence analysts start going through their files trying to figure out what he means. He doesn't specify. Options on the table include poison gas, some new explosive technology, long-range rockets, or just theatrical bluffing. The answer won't become clear for years. The weapon he's hinting at may be the magnetic mine, which is about to cause some serious problems for Allied shipping. Or it just could have been straightforward propaganda designed to make Britain nervous. Either way, it works. The phrase, secret weapon, enters the British consciousness and stays there.
Also, on September 19th, the Battle of the Bzura is finally over. It had been the largest battle of the entire Polish campaign. 170,000 Polish soldiers launched a counteroffensive that significantly disrupts the German advance. It fails in the end, and when it fails, 170,000 Polish prisoners are taken, the same number who attacked. The army that fought hardest to save Poland becomes prisoners on the day Poland loses.
And on September 19th, the Soviet invasion reaches the Hungarian border in the south and captures Vilna in the north. German and Soviet forces formally link up at Brest-Litovsk. The two armies that invaded Poland from opposite ends of the country have now met in the middle. Poland has been cut in half. The military campaign is not quite over. Warsaw still holds, and a few pockets of resistance remain, but the outcome is no longer in doubt.
Canada, quietly but importantly, approves a construction program for 110 warships on September 19th, Flower-class corvettes and Banger-class minesweepers. The country that went to war with a biplane reconnaissance patrol 9 days ago is now commissioning a fleet. That's the speed at which this war is forcing everyone to move.
So, where are we at the end of September 19th? Poland has been invaded from two sides by the two largest land armies in Europe. Its government is in a Romanian internment camp. Its capital is under siege. The army that fought back hardest is now in captivity. France watched all of this from behind the Siegfried Line and went home. Britain lost an aircraft carrier and learned an important lesson about how not to fight submarines. The Soviet Union and Germany are shaking hands in Brest-Litovsk. A Polish philosopher heard the news and decided he had seen enough.
And yet, the Enigma experts are on a train to Paris. The Orzel is somewhere in the Baltic with no charts, on its way to Scotland. Warsaw is still being hit. There is still something left to fight with and fight for, even if it is much harder to see now than it was 3 weeks ago. Next episode, Warsaw's final weeks. The Polish government in exile begins to organize, and the world starts to settle into what people will eventually call the Phony War. A period where the guns on the Western Front go quiet and everybody just waits to see what comes next.
Thanks for joining us for episode 4 of History Date Night. We'll see you next time.
See you then.